Welcome everybody to today's meeting of Governance and Audit, both those that are participating and those who are watching from home. If you have any technical difficulties during the meeting, then please contact Democratic Services Officer on call, who will attempt to assist you. Today's officer on call is Emily Kennedy, and the number to call is 577046. I would ask participants, when you are speaking, please mute your microphone. Ask participants, when you are not speaking, please mute your microphone. This minimizes background noise and will help everybody in listening to the proceedings. Microphones must only be on if the participant has been granted permission to speak. To gain my permission to speak, please very briefly indicate in the chat to the right side of the screen, and I will then make a note and go back to you once the person speaking has finished. The meeting environment. Would everybody present please ensure their microphones are turned to silent and they're not used, their mobile phones are turned to silent and they're not used to make or receive phone calls whilst the meeting is in progress. Please also refrain from checking emails on conducting other business and ensure that you're in a quiet room free from distractions for the duration of the meeting. Please note this meeting is being live streamed for members of the public. The meeting will also be recorded and will be subsequently broadcast on the internet. I now deal with the attendance. Please, I'll ask members of the committee to confirm that they're present in the meeting when I read out your name. I will ask for the attendance of those councillors who are participating in order to speak under Council Procedure Rule 20.1 separately. So I'll read out the list of councillors who should be attending. Councillor Campbell.
Present.
Councillor Dexter.
Here, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Boyd.
Here, Chairman.
Councillor Braidwood.
Present.
Councillor Crittenden.
Present.
Councillor Curry. Councillor Curry, no. Councillor Garner.
I'm present.
I have apologies for Councillor Cook. Councillor Pat Moore.
Present.
Councillor Shrub.
Here, Chair.
And Councillor Towning. No councillor.
Present.
Sorry?
I am here.
Okay, present. I haven't received any requests from councillors to speak. Are there any members who would like to speak under Rule 20.1? No.
Yes, please, Chair. Sorry, Chair. Councillor Ashby.
Councillor Ashby.
Yes, please. On item 8, please.
Item 8.
Thank you.
Item 8 has been moved forwards to the position of item 5. So you should get that earlier, Councillor Ashby.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be able to watch my football team then.
Right, 8. We've only got one apology for absence, unless anybody else has any apologies. Are there any declarations of interest? No. We now move on to the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 4th of March. Copy attached to your agenda pack. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder? Unless I hear an objection.
Proposed, Councillor Campbell.
And a seconder,
I'll second that, Councillor Shrub.
Councillor Shrub. Thank you very much. The minutes are approved. Yes?
Yes.
Agenda item 4, quarterly internal audit update report. I'll now call on Simon Webb to introduce the report, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. This is our regular quarterly internal audit update report, summarising the work of the internal audit department on your behalf in the last quarter, together with the performance of the East Kent Audit Partnership through to the 31st of May 2020. If I could draw your attention to the table on page 13, that summarises the 10 new audits completed during this period. The majority of these were 2019-2020 audits that were finalised in March, April and early May, just as we started to enter the COVID period. Very pleased to be able to report substantial assurance and with very few recommendations for improvement in the areas of Treasury Management, Ramsgate Marina, insurance and inventories of portable equipment, capital, housing rents and printing, postage and photocopying. We did record limited assurance in the area of employee health and safety at East Kent Housing. That is an area that will be coming back in-house to Thanet District Council on the 1st of October and will come under the employee health and safety arrangements currently in place within the council itself. So we will be looking for substantial improvement in that area, and I am confident that that will take place. At 2.8 in the table, you can see we undertook a very large audit of housing repairs, maintenance and void property management. We split the assurance in that area, substantial, reasonable and limited. Disappointingly, it was limited assurance in the key area of housing repairs, particularly surrounding contract management of the MERS contract, with key controls such as post-inspections not being undertaken on a regular basis. So we will be looking for substantial improvement in that area. As I said, East Kent Housing, the housing service will come back in-house on the 1st of October under the council's direct control. And so we will be looking at that area again after that date. 2.9, which is the turn of page onto page 14 of the agenda. We undertook an audit of building control. We did conclude limited assurance in that area, but I feel it is an area that should go up to at least reasonable at the time of follow-up, which will be undertaken in the next quarter. At the time of audit field work, there were some changes in management arrangements in that area, and management were in the process of dealing with some of the control weaknesses that were identified by the audit. So whilst it's limited assurance, it's not an area of great concern to us at the present time, providing we see at the time of follow-up improvement in that area. As I've mentioned at previous meetings, follow-up is a very important part of internal audit work. 3 to 6 months after each audit, we go back to see if the recommendations that were agreed with management have been implemented. And if I could draw your attention to the table on page 24, you will see that we undertook 4 follow-up reviews during the current period. The first one in that list, item A, tenant health and safety. Members will be aware of the concerns that have been had in that area for quite some time, and the referral of this matter to the housing regulator. This was a follow-up of lifts. The original assurance at the time of the original audit was no assurance. And unfortunately, it was still no assurance at the time of follow-up. We are going back and undertaking a second follow-up that has started in the last week. So by the time of the September meeting, we should be able to update you just before the housing service comes back in-house on the 1st of October, hopefully with an increased assurance level in that area. It is very important, particularly obviously as Thanet has more high-rise blocks than some of the surrounding districts such as Canterbury, Dover and Folkestone. So we will be paying particular attention to that area. The audit of PCI DSS, it's been a bit like painting the fourth bridge, that audit. We seem to keep doing that one. We are, however, nearly there. Whilst the assurance level is still reasonable stroke limited, the outstanding areas are very, very few, and just a little bit more push will take it up to wholly reasonable assurance. Included as appendices to the report is the plan progress table starting on page 29, which shows the days spent on the 2021 plan that you agreed just before lockdown in early March, and that includes the days that we've spent up to the 31st of May. Members won't be surprised that obviously there has been some disruption to the audit plan with lockdown, with staff being redeployed into more essential areas during the initial months of the financial year. Consequently, the figures at the 31st of May look low. I can, however, assure you that we are now auditing in earnest and have good amount of audits currently underway. So by the time we get to September, I think we will have made fairly good progress against the plan, considering the slow start due to COVID. The other appendices are the usual ones that you will have seen in previous quarters, which show the follow-ups that we still need to undertake of areas previously concluded limited assurance. That's really just to keep them on the radar so that you can see that they will be coming forward to future meetings. That's it from me, Chair, but obviously happy to take questions on any of the audits undertaken from any members. Thank you.
Do members have any comments to make on this item?
Chair, Councillor Campbell.
Go ahead, Councillor Campbell.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't put it in the bubble.
Yeah,
thank you very much for that presentation. My question was almost answered, really, the impact of the coronavirus on your audit process, and whether or not you feel you'll be able to carry out the full audit throughout the whole year. You'll be able to catch up. I noticed that it's had a severe effect for the first 3 months. Whether or not, as I say, you'll be able to carry that out, Mr. Webb, throughout the whole year.
Thank you, Councillor. It's slightly early to be able to predict, but I am very positively impressed by the amount of audits that have been green-lighted in the last few weeks. We do have quite a lot of audits underway now, with more being approved each day. The next item on the agenda tonight is the annual internal audit report. And obviously looking ahead to the annual internal audit report for next year, obviously we need to undertake a reasonable percentage of agreed plan to be able to provide you with an opinion. We did lose, obviously, certainly April, May, due to COVID and redeployment of staff. We have, however, prioritised audits from June onwards that are audits that we could do largely remotely using technology such as this to speak to officers. A lot of the audit testing can be done remotely. Other audits where we need to do physical inspections of properties or playgrounds, that type of thing, we've pushed back into quarters 3 and 4, and hopefully the lockdown measures will continue to ease and we will hopefully be getting back to some sort of normal as we used to understand that word. So it's a little bit early to say categorically that we're on target, but it's going very much in the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor.
Is there anybody else that would like to make any comment? No. The reports, I'd like to say the reports received by members, and that any changes to the agreed 2021 internal audit plan resulting from the changes in perceived risk detailed at point 5 of Annex 1 of the attached report be approved. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder?
I propose Councillor Campbell.
Councillor Campbell, seconder. Councillor Dexter? No?
Sorry, I had to turn my mic off. Yes, I'll second that proposal.
Okay, that's proposed and seconded. No objections to that. I'll take these as approved. Now we're moving on to item 8 as opposed to 5. I'll call upon Christine Parker to introduce the report, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. The page numbers that I've noted down for the presentation are those that are on ModGov. I haven't got individual page numbers for our reports within that, so I'll just refer to paragraph numbers. But do stop me, members, if I lose you and you want me to reorientate you on the report. So firstly, page 114, the covering report to this year's annual report. In paragraph 1.1, it sets out the purpose of the report. And the 6 bullet points listed are very important for this committee and you as members in terms of us demonstrating that we're complying with our professional standards to ensure quality and value for money from internal audit service, but also with the next item on the agenda, which is your annual governance statement. A lot of your assurances, not all because they do come from other sources, but a lot of your assurances will come from the work of internal audit, the detailed look at the internal controls in operation throughout the year. Consequently, the report is in 2 parts then. Part 1 covers, compares what the internal audit service has delivered against that which we promised and planned to do last March, and how well we have met our professional standards and the quality against our performance measures in order for me to be able to provide you with that opinion. I'll not focus on this part of the report through the presentation, but we will come back to that at the conclusion. And the arguably more important aspect of the report describes the summary of the work undertaken, the results, and more importantly, as we talk about the so what, in terms of how well has the identified control and risks that we've raised throughout the year within individual pieces of work been responded to by management. What control shift has that actually achieved for the organisation, and therefore how much assurance does this provide the committee for you to be able to fulfil your responsibilities? So if we take a sort of trot through the report and the paragraphs that follow within the main report, in paragraph 4, we give an overview of the work that has been done. So there were 22 projects planned and 12 were pushed back for various reasons. 4 new ones were pulled forward with a higher priority rating, and 3 were work in progress at the year end. And additionally, 5 were completed that were on the cusp from April last year into April. So the report takes 2 snapshots of the results of all of that work, and it is, members, a summary really of all the 4 previous meetings that we've held. So there's nothing new in the actual reports themselves. The table at paragraph 4.1 shows that 87 recommendations have been made in those reports and agreed. 3 were critical, 37 were high risk, and 26 were medium risk. So 86%, all of which have been reported to the committee. And then the second snapshot is in paragraph 4.2, and that summarises the assurance levels over the reports. And that table concludes that 64% were either substantial or reasonable assurance. We then go on to talk about the follow-up and the progress reports in paragraph 4.3. I think we mentioned before, we consider this to be the most important aspect of our work. It's one thing to go in and take an initial snapshot in time of what we find on the day, but then we go back and ask, So what? What's changed as a result of those recommendations, and how much has that affected the systems of governance and internal control, and the risks, have they all improved? So the results show that one review had a partially limited assurance after follow-up, and that was escalated to the committee during the year. And 3 risks were escalated that were outstanding at the time of follow-up, and they were escalated to the committee during the year as well. Paragraph 5 goes on to provide an overall assessment of the internal controls for 1920. And the points to note there were 5 new areas in the year with a partially limited assurance, and these reviews will be followed up in due course. So the table at paragraph 6 lists those. And as Mr. Webb was explaining in the last report, they will show on the annex to the quarterly report until those follow-ups have been done. And we'll come back to you with the revised assurance. Paragraph 6 goes on to raise any significant issues throughout the year. And we mentioned in paragraph 4.4 a matter where there was officer dishonesty and they resigned. And the theme of the limited assurances in some of the key areas that we have reviewed during the year. One theme there was some lengthy delays in obtaining management responses to our work. And of course, we had taken into account the world pandemic, and that effect is also, of course, noted. So as Mr. Webb also has explained, things are starting to get back to normal. But some of those delays have been lengthy, and we have noted that theme. We go on to list the areas that have yet to be followed up, as we've mentioned. So the report also concludes the work that's been undertaken for East Kent Services. Their full annual report is appended at Appendix 4 to your report. It comes to the Thanet Governance and Audit Committee because Thanet hosts the East Kent Services. Dover District Council and Canterbury City Council rely on the report being presented to you, much in the same way as the East Kent Housing annual report goes to Housing Board, and you rely on it being presented there. And of course, those results are also featured in summary form in this report. So the opinion for East Kent Services overall provides a reasonable assurance. And the annual report for East Kent Housing, which was, as I say, mentioned, presented to the East Kent Housing Board on the 17th of June. As members will know, East Kent Housing is being wound up. So this will be the last annual report for East Kent Housing that we present. And this concluded a limited assurance. Key risks noted in our work with regards to contract management and tenants' health and safety, and they've been highlighted to this committee throughout the year as those reports have come forward. This leads me then to paragraph 7 of the report and my overall opinion. One point to note, members, as well, the definitions for our assurances in my Appendix 1 are different to the definitions in the quarterly report that you have just received. The reason for this is these are the definitions for last year, and that's why it was important to make that distinction. From April, we have adopted the new SIPA definitions. They're not massively different, but it brings us in line with the new professional standards. So all work from April this year will go forward with those definitions. I mentioned our performance against targets, so I just highlight to members Appendix 5, which is the balanced scorecard, showing the performance against the performance of our team. And that's for the whole team, not just for the work that we've undertaken for Thanet. So paragraph 7 therefore concludes a reasonable assurance overall. And this opinion is based on the internal audit work completed and reported to the committee over the last 4 meetings. However, I do have some small caveats to this opinion based on work that I've been involved with during the year, which isn't completed and therefore is not covered by this assurance opinion. I've raised concerns with the 3 statutory officers, with Grant Thornton and with the chair and the vice chair of this committee, and the matters will be resolved within 2021 and will therefore be reported in either annual reports or annual governance statements this time next year, effectively. So the report is received for receiving. The committee is provided at paragraph 2 with 2 options. The members can consider and note the report, and members can consider registering their comments with Cabinet in respect of any areas of the Council's corporate governance, risk or control frameworks for which they have ongoing comments after considering the work of internal audit. Thank you, Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I have Councillor Mike Garner on the list would like to ask a question.
Hi, yeah. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Christine. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask about from a couple of areas in the report, if you don't mind. The first area I'd like to ask you about is going back to section 4.4, which you briefly touched on. But at the end there, you mention a whistleblowing fact-finding matter, which was not fully concluded in the year. Would it be possible, well, I've got a couple of questions about that. Firstly, do you consider this a serious matter? And would it be possible for you to just tell us maybe a little bit more about it? And then also, when do you think that will be completed, that fact-finding matter that you're progressing? And if not, what is stopping it? What is stopping you completing that, if anything? And just one other, do you think it's appropriately prioritised within the council, the progression of this piece of work? So if I just stick to that for now, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. Yes, I think the matters are very serious, and I think there has been a full and thorough commissioning of some work to be undertaken to understand what those issues are and for those to be resolved. In terms of how that moves forward at this point, it would appear there have been other sort of factors. The council has received, I guess if you go back through the stages, through the process, this links into some of the concerns that I have in terms of governance, in terms of matters being resolved in a timely matter and following process. I think in public session, councillors, there's not very much detail that I can go into in terms of when it might be resolved and why it hasn't been resolved before now. But ultimately to say that those are matters that I have raised concerns around.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. If there's just another area of concern, if you don't mind, I'd just like to ask you about, and that is in section 5. You mention in there themes or emerging evidence of management override. Can you just explain, just in layman's terms, maybe what that means, so as we can better understand that, what that is, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question. Yes, in terms of good governance, of course, what we are encouraged to understand is that we have procedures and controls and processes that direct and control a council's functions. And it's our expectation that when we go in and do our testing, that we can obviously pick a sample of transactions and ensure that they have followed the procedures and the processes that are expected. I think the work that is leading to these concerns or these thoughts is when those processes and controls aren't followed. And there may be numerous reasons why that is the case, but I think Grant Thornton have a risk in their planning work, and they're looking for management override of control. So this is the normal expected process, and how often is that not followed for whatever reason, and then they would test for that as well. So it's something that Grant Thornton predominantly would be testing for. But in terms of our work, the concern is that policy and procedure is consistently and effectively followed, and that's the evidence that we're noticing. Thank you.
Okay, just one final thing. In Appendix 2, I think you've got 25 days spent investigating a whistleblower investigation. Is that all allocated to the one that you mentioned in 4.4, where the employee has left, or does any of that or is there some of that that relates to ongoing investigations? And also, like, will there need to be more man or person days allocated to whistleblowing investigations? And if you think there is, then how many do you think that might be? Sorry, there's a number of questions there.
Thank you. I think I've got
that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, so in the table that Councillor refers to, there are two areas. One with the investigation with 10.37 days. That is the one where the officer allegedly was dishonest and left. And the other matter with the 25 days is a matter where I was asked to act as a commissioning officer to look into the whistleblowing matters, and that work commenced in August last year.
So all that okay. So there's two. So the 25 days doesn't include any of that for the one where the officer left. That's all to do with the one that we talked about at the beginning of this in 4.4.
Correct. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for your answers on that. That's all I've got for now. Thank you very much.
We have Councillor Campbell would like to ask a question. If you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, Councillor Garner asked the question about management override. I just wondered what it was, but you fully explained that. As that's been explained, I'd just like to thank you and your team for another excellent year of audit, and thank you very much, particularly discovering the failing of East Kent Housing and the safety situations that you discovered last year, which really put us on our mettle. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you and your team. Thank you.
And now, Councillor Ashby, would you like to speak under?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd like to refer to 4.4. I know you mentioned about this, but what was the financial irregularity, if you could outline that? You mentioned that the officer resigned, but I'm not sure as to why that would stop an investigation and maybe a prosecution. Why wasn't the investigation followed through? Councillor Garner asked the point regarding the whistleblower. I would just like to know where exactly is the blockage in the process or in the system as to why it's taken so long to move that one forward. Item 5, again, that was covered by Councillor Garner, and I think that I'd like to, it is a serious matter, so I'll be happy that that has been fully covered. And lastly, on paragraphs, item 7, regarding you mentioned the reasonable assurance. Do we not feel that that is quite a low threshold? And when was the last time you actually concluded reasonable assurance? What are the instances in weaknesses in the anti-fraud and corruption and whistleblowing? And if we regard this as a low threshold, what are we actually doing to maybe beef up the process and try and raise the bar on that one? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. What I can probably say about the allegations in the case at 4.4, they were largely, breaches of financial procedure rules, and but more importantly, the principle of internal check, where one officer is required to prepare work, another officer obviously required to authorise expenditure. And the controls around that were the main controls that have failed. I think it's important to note that the controls around budget management and the procedure rules there were also ones where you were the matter to have reached its hearing, and it didn't. So we can only talk about what obviously the fact-finding report had got to a point of trying to conclude was whether or not the officer had abused their position in that regard in terms of their authority to make those payments against that budget heading. So it was very much around breaching the financial procedure rules, and whether it was a matter of £50 or £5,000, it's the same principle, and obviously the officer resigned before the hearing, so the matter was not concluded in the sense of taking it forward to either determining that they had or hadn't breached the rules. And then the next step, had that happened, then the next step may have been a referral through, following the policy, through to the police. Clearly those steps didn't happen as we didn't reach the hearing. So moving forward, in terms of why the whistleblowing hasn't been resolved, it's something that maybe one of the other officers might like to come in on. In terms of, the council has received, so it received a whistleblow, it commissioned a fact-finding investigation, which would be an outcome report. The council has received an outcome report, and it is arrangements around how that outcome report is, and the recommendations within that report are taken forward. That is the point where it has not moved forward since January of this year. I don't know the reasons. I mean, we've had a world pandemic. There's many. I'm sure there's multiple reasons. And your last questions around the threshold of reasonable assurance. I think, you know, what we're trying to say in that whole paragraph is we can't give absolute assurance. Many a time we've looked at a system before. I mean, one of our considerations when we look at risk is, what do we know about this? When did we last audit, and what's changed since? Is it the same system, the same people? What can we expect? And we can go in and have a complete shock sometimes. Everything's gone completely wrong since our last audit. So it is a snapshot in time. It can only be really valid from the day that we're there and the findings that we make. So we can't give absolute assurance. And we hear about things. We heard about one in the briefing, and it's to follow in the report later in the agenda, where somebody was on holiday and somebody else covered, and an error occurred. So those things can happen with control systems, of course, especially when we're dealing with people and computers. So it is for the council just to determine where they want their standard to be. I think a reasonable assurance is, the reasonable assurance in that sentence is all about that management are taking note, they're receiving our reports, they're responding to the control risks that we find. Because obviously there's a drafting process in terms of, we think this is a risk, do you agree, what are we going to do about it? Those are the recommendations before we assign a due date and a responsible officer. So it's then measuring how well they have been implemented when we go back to do the progress report, and us expecting those things to have moved on in that time, so that we can report back and say, yeah, there were some issues, they've now been resolved. You can have a reasonable assurance that that process is working well. So in terms of, we haven't, I don't think across the partnership issued a substantial assurance across the piece. I think it would be unusual for us to do that, to find we have pockets of excellence everywhere, but it probably isn't across the piece. I hope that answers your question. But in terms of your confidence that management take note of our findings and respond to them, then that is a strong message that is happening. Thank you.
Councillor Ashby, did you have a...
Sorry, Chair. Yeah, I mean, the only point is the officer that is resigning would somewhat indicate that maybe there was an element of guilt there. So I'm just wondering, I mean, having been involved in my career before, the fact that you resign, you know, the fact of the matter is there might still have been an illegal act there. So I just wonder why it couldn't have been taken forward. If it, I mean, regardless, like you say, whether it was £50 or £5 million, it's irrelevant. The fact that someone has committed an illegal act. So did we not feel that it was an illegal act? It was just a breach of maybe system procedure or control, as opposed to an illegal act? Because if it was an illegal act, then surely it needed to be going forward, just to set an example that the council is not willing to tolerate that type of action. Thank you.
Sorry, Chairman, can I just come in at that point, just to make clear that somebody's resignation, you know, it isn't to be taken as a symbol of guilt. I mean, that's wrong. But nevertheless, you know, there was a process set up. she actually resigned before the process could begin, so we weren't able to actually define or come to a conclusion about her innocence and guilt. So on that basis, then, once you leave, you cannot then be disciplined because you're no longer an employee.
Then, Mr. Howes, what's the situation about pulling in police, or the decision whether or not a criminal investigation should be taken?
That was looked at, I think, at the time, and due to the circumstances of the case, and I don't want to go into it any further, the view was taken that that was not appropriate. There was no requirement to do that, but I think, given the circumstances of the case, that wasn't appropriate.
I think I've got Councillor Campbell again on the list. Would you?
No, I've already spoken. Thank you.
Well, this report's going on to Cabinet, I believe, which I think is a good thing. These issues need to be dealt with. I've never seen quite so many come along in one meeting, having been on this committee for many years. We'll move this. Can I have a proposer and a seconder for this item, please?
I propose Councillor Campbell.
And I'll second Councillor Dexter.
As we have no other objections to this, that's
and just to make it clear, Mr. Chairman, that the is going to be forward to Cabinet, this issue. Is that correct?
That's the position at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
I now move on to agenda item 5, annual governance statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, this is the annual governance statement, and as the internal auditor has already said, this draws together a lot of information from the internal audit team, as well as information from other teams, and that the governance work undertaken by various committees of the council. It does set out the key governance issues and concerns at the end, and with an action plan for improvement. I should say I did make one error in. I wrongly copied over the section of the report which deals with the significant issues and overall conclusions from the internal audit annual report. So the version which will go forward will include those matters which you've already seen in the previous report. So it's here for agreement, and it'll then go on to our external auditors, who will consider it and make any necessary amendments before it gets published.
Right. Do members have any comments to make? Councillor Garner.
Yeah, just one brief comment from page 4 of the report, really, about council. It mentions that on the 11th of July, council agreed to for 4 groups to work together to look at a system of governance, and that nothing has been fed back on that.
Yeah.
I don't think there's been a great deal of impetus given to this, and sufficient support, I don't believe, from council officers to help that group that was set up actually do that. Would it be possible? This may not be the appropriate forum, but would it be possible actually to get some officer support for that group of councillors to progress that piece of work, please?
Yeah, so if I can reply to that point. The decision of council was very specific when it said that actually it was going to be led by members and they didn't want officer input. So the decision of council was that the members would go away and consider it without officer input and then come back at some point. So that hasn't happened. So they specifically did not want officer input.
Okay, I don't. Okay, well, I'll get back to that committee, toot sweet, and make sure that they get any requests they might be required in. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. The committee is asked to agree the draft annual governance statement 2019-20, which will be shared with our external auditors for amendment, if necessary, prior to publication. Please, can I have a proposer and a seconder?
I'll propose, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I'll second, Councillor Campbell.
Okay. I hear no objections, so these are approved. Here we go. We move on to agenda item 6, accounting policies. Will Chris Blundell introduce this report, please?
Thank you, Chair. So this paper sets out the accounting policies that the Council apply for the 2019-20 final accounts, and also proposes the accounting policies for the 2020-21 accounts. In addition, also gives an update on how the closure of this year's accounts is progressing. So just a bit of a recap. What are accounting policy? So effectively, they are the principles, conventions, rules, practices and methods that the Council applies when we prepare and present our financial statements for the committee to consider. So, for example, they might set out how we value our assets or recognise our pension liabilities. So they're a fundamental part of our accounts, which the committee is responsible for approving. So the purpose of this paper is to bring them here in advance of that, in case there are any questions that the committee wanted to ask before they are presented as part of the accounts for overall approval of the statements for that year. I don't intend to go through the individual accounting policies because they are quite lengthy, but I'm happy to take any questions on them either individually or collectively. The individual accounting policies are set out in the annexes to the paper that detail the policies we want the committee to approve. Supplementary agenda item as there was a typographical error that needed to be updated. The only minor amendment that's actually been proposed to the 2020-21 accounting policy is an increase in the minimum limit for capital expenditure, and that's increased from £10,000 to £15,000. So from April 20 onwards, that means any expenditure below £15,000 will now be considered revenue, even if it meets the other definitions and criteria in order to qualify as capital. Moving on, so changes to the statutory deadlines for the closure of accounts. Typically at this July meeting, the committee would be approving our final accounts, not just our accounting policies. However, due to COVID-19, these deadlines have been extended for 1 year only. The changes that have been made are that the committee will now have to consider the accounts for approval prior to 30th November for this year. So we will need to arrange an additional committee meeting to consider that closer to the date. We now intend to publish our draft accounts on the 27th of August, and we will commence public inspection from the 1st of September. So in sum, the paper is asking the committee to approve the accounting policies and also note the changes to the statutory deadline for closure of accounts. Happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions on this item? In that case, can I have a proposer and a seconder, please?
I'll propose Councillor Shrub.
Thank you.
I'll second it, Cedric.
Thank you. I'll take these as approved and introduce item 7, the in-depth insight into the impact of COVID-19 on financial reporting in the local government sector. Again, Chris Blundell, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. If I could actually pass councillors over to Sebastian Evans from Grant Thornton, who will talk the committee through this paper.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. Can you hear and see me, just to double check before I begin?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So as you're aware, there is a separate paper at the end of this agenda, which sort of talks in slightly more detail about how the sort of impact of COVID-19 will apply in connection with the audit. But we also sent Chris earlier this year was essentially for a publication Grant Thornton have made, which sort of talks through some of the areas which could potentially have an impact on the authority, or indeed on all types of authority, essentially within the local government sector. And I'm not necessarily proposing to talk through the detail of this, but in summary, what this deals with is, I think, some of the financial reporting considerations, sort of with respect to sort of some of these sort of recent events, both in terms of your 31st of March accounts, which year end, but also, I suppose, sort of further commentary on, I think, sort of different sort of potential issues which might have an impact in the future as well. And you will see at the bottom, I suppose, if you have any sort of further questions on this, we do have a team who will be able to sort of provide responses on that. That being said, of course, this is an area which is sort of quite integral to our audit. As I said, as I'll describe in the audit plan addendum being presented later, there are specific additional procedures which we'll be looking at, both in respect to the overarching risks presented by COVID-19, but also in terms of sort of work streams which we would be doing anyway, for example, such as looking at the valuation of property, plant and equipment, but considering the impact of COVID-19 on things such as, say, sort of assumptions around the valuation of assets, given a lot of the sensitivities around sort of valuation arising as a direct result of COVID-19 restrictions. That's a summary. I'm happy to take any questions.
I have nobody on the chat board. Would anybody have any questions or no?
Yes, I'll put a notice, me please. Yeah, Chair.
I've got it now. Yeah, at the bottom. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Evans. It seems to me more a sort of general overview of the effect of COVID on local government. Can you give us any particular ideas whether the COVID has specifically affected adversely Thanet?
Thank you. Yes. So one of the items that'll sort of partly be covered, I think, as part of agenda item 11 at the end. But I think in terms of sort of the general approach on our audit, I think the first thing to note is that for this year, a lot of the changes that will sort of, such as additional funding received from government and the impact of that on the accounts won't be felt until the subsequent audit year, i.e. sort of year commencing sort of 1st of April 2020. I think simply because the period of lockdown being proposed around 8 days at the end of March was relatively brief. But the sort of areas where we would sort of do specific procedures would be things such as, say, accounts receivable. There might be sort of, because that has to take into account future information based on, say, the recoverability of debt, then that is an area which we would have to look at. And again, I think that applies sort of more generally, sort of rather than specifically to Thanet. But I suppose with any sort of areas you particularly had in mind with respect to Thanet.
Come back, Councillor Campbell.
Well, only that obviously we are a seaside town, a seaside district, and the impact upon visitor numbers and revenue streams and other issues that may impact adversely to Thanet and other seaside towns, but particularly Thanet, will be of interest.
Okay. Councillor Ashby, you have a question. Councillor Ash? frozen. Okay.
I suppose you could go to someone else, Chair, and then maybe come back to her.
There's nobody else on the list.
Chair, I wonder if I could just help with Councillor Campbell's question of Sebastian Evans.
Yeah.
What I would say is that the July 30th Cabinet agenda is published now, just published today, and that includes our estimate of the financial impact of COVID-19 on the Council's finances for this financial year.
It does, right. Any luck with Councillor
Willis?
Yeah. Oh. I'm here, but I can't.
We can hear you.
I'm having trouble turning my microphone off.
I think everyone can hear you, Councillor
I've
Ashby.
frozen out.
Your microphone's on, Councillor Ashby.
It might be that we have to move on, Chairman, unless she pops up again now.
Members are being asked to note this report.
Noted.
Noted. We now move on to item 9, quarterly risk management report. Would Tim Wills introduce this, please?
Willis, thank you, Chair. Yes, this is the normal quarterly risk report. It sets out the main corporate risks of the council. Members will see that there's a new risk that's been added this quarter, referring to COVID-19. I'd also draw attention to the fact that the pandemic has increased pressure on the council's finances, although this hasn't changed the risk score in respect of finance since the last quarter. And also COVID-19 has the potential to complicate preparations for Brexit, but this is at this stage difficult to quantify. I'm happy to answer any questions on the report, Chair.
Okay, do members have any comments to make on this item? Could I have a proposer and a seconder then, please?
I'll propose Councillor Garner.
Thank you.
Seconded, Councillor Campbell. Oh,
Thank
all right. Councillor Dexter will do.
Okay. Thank you. I'll take this as approved, and we can move on to item 10, Treasury Management Outturn Report. Chris Blundell to bring this report to the committee. Thank you. No.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I just had difficulty unmuting my mic there. Yeah, this report is part of our annual reporting cycle on our treasury management activities. So this is a backwards look on how we performed during 1920. As I was explaining earlier, our final accounts haven't been completed yet, so the numbers contained within this report are provisional still. If there are any significant changes, we will subsequently bring this report back for further consideration, but they are proposed for members' approval as they are in their current form. So contained within the report, there are a number of performance indicators that we have to report against from a statutory requirement. The report's separated into two main parts. One's around our cash flows and how we manage our cash, and that's ensuring we have enough cash in the bank to pay our bills, and that we're investing our surpluses wisely. And the other aspect of treasury management is around how we fund our capital program So capital program deals with expenditure items relating to acquisition or investment in our assets, such as buildings and vehicles. And when we talk about how we fund our capital program, we think about how we're paying for that investment in our assets. So it's typically from borrowing or from the proceeds from asset disposals. So taking you through the report, section 3, when we look at capital expenditure, you'll see there's been an underspend significantly against both the general fund and the housing revenue account budgets. So we had budgets in the year of £36 million, but only spent around £17.5 million of that. So this is actually a bit of a historic trend that needs to be tackled, and we'll be looking at going forwards. It's anticipated that there probably will be further slippage in the capital program in 2020-21 because of COVID and related pressures on the organisation. The actual detail behind those underspends will be reported to Cabinet. As Mr. Willis explained earlier, there's a report going to Cabinet in July, but also subsequently there'll be further reports in September. We'll have even more detail on our draft outturn position. So beyond that, section 4 looks at our borrowing need, and this section explains what our borrowing need is, or what's often referred to our capital finance requirement. So I like to think of it as the balance payable or outstanding on the debts that we've taken out to buy our assets. So one of the requirements we have is to conform with, that's set out in the statute, is that our capital finance requirement, or our need to borrow, should not be higher in the short term, at least, than the actual debt that we have that we're borrowing at the time. So the good news that I can report is that we were only holding at the year end £25 million of debt, and that we actually had total future debt repayments left to make of £50 million. So that might lead you to question how we're going to make up that difference, the shortfall between the two. And this is explained a bit further in section 5. But the answer is the fact that we're doing something that's called under borrowing, or we are under borrowed. And that effectively is using our reserves and any money that we hold instead of going to banks externally to finance that debt. Section 4.7, that's another statutory requirement they have to report on. So the authorised limit is the maximum debt that we're allowed to hold during a year. So I'm pleased to report that the maximum debt that we're holding was 30.5 million, and that was well below the £103 million statutory limit. Taking a quick look at section 5, treasury management position. I've already spoke about the debt, so I won't go over that in too much detail, apart from say that you can see that pretty much almost all of our debt that we hold is with the Public Works Loan Board, PWLB. The exception of that is there's 4.5 million that's placed with Barclays, and there's 22,000 that's placed with another institution that is called Thanet, and that's around energy efficiency. That's why the interest rate attached to that debt is 0. Table 5.5 shows when we expect to repay our debt over the next 50 years, the profile repayment. Moving away from debt in terms of investments, this section shows that at the year end we had £33.9 million worth of investments on our book. So that exceeded the 25 million of gross debt that I mentioned earlier by about £8.9 million. So you consider we're in a net investment position at year end. Table 5.6 also shows the types of investment that we place our money in, and you can see that they're very low risk type of investments, sort of money market funds and fixed term deposits. Section 6, this gives an overview of how interest rates have changed during the year and the sort of the overall investment environment. The key takeaway from this section is that we've kept our investment balances low, again, as I've mentioned earlier, by using our reserves and balances to support this internal borrowing rather than taking on external debt. So if we borrowed externally, that would have boosted the amount of cash, and our investment balances would have been higher. But the report sets out and explains the reasons and benefits that we've actually used this under borrowing, internal borrowing position instead. 6.2 talks about the borrowing strategy and how borrowing changed in a year. There's a few charts and tables in there explaining how the PWLB rates moved during the year. And the PWLB rate, I should say, is how is what we tend to borrow at. Members may note there was a 1% increase in the PWLB rate in October. This was partially reserved on the 11th of March, and so more information on how those rates changed. There's been some consultation on the use of PWRB. Fundamentally, government is consulting on much greater restrictions on the amount or even the facility being available for local authorities to invest from the PWB to support commercial investment. And this is something we don't think will be available going forwards. Section 7, borrowing outturn. So no borrowing was actually undertaken during the year. We repaid £5.4 million of the debt, as shown in the table, and the average interest rate is 3.8% on the debt we're holding. Section 8. So key things to note in the report. So Christine Parker mentioned earlier around how there can be a failure of internal controls. So there was a substantial assurance, on our treasury management that was reported earlier, but actually there was a failure of control that I need to report where we breached our overdraft limit because of a clerical error where one of our officers that usually deals with our daily investments was on annual leave, and the officer that usually covers them was sick, and another officer who was supposed to be covering them effectively failed to undertake the daily banking tasks, which resulted in being overdrawn for a day. This was despite all the controls being in place that were satisfactory, the procedure rules, there are appointments of people's diaries to this task. It was just pure human error. The other thing that I need to report in this section is from April onwards, although it's not a backwards look, but it still needs to be reported, our counterparty limit with our main bank was exceeded, but this was because of exceptional operational circumstances. Because we received a huge sum of money came into our accounts, around £40 million, to deal with relief to provide to businesses in respect to COVID support. So that meant that at one particular time we were holding balances that were in excess of the £7 million that we're allowed to hold with one counterparty, but that was deemed acceptable and due to the operational circumstances. Just finally then, so you can see on average we held £46.3 million during the year in terms of investments, and we got an interest rate of 0.8. So that's significantly below the average rate of 3.8 that we're paying on our borrowers. Again, supports the strategy of why we tend to use our reserves and balances instead of going out to the market to borrow if we have to. Section 9, just to finish off, just talks around some of the risk benchmarks that I'm pleased to report that we have met in full. Happy to take any questions.
Do members have any questions or comments to make on this report, please? I just can't see any. Okay, so this committee, the recommendations are: notes the actual 29-20 Prudential Treasury indicators in this report, approves this annual Treasury Management Report for 2019-20, and that we recommend the report to Cabinet and Council. Please may I have a proposer and a seconder?
I'll propose.
Thank you. And a seconder?
Councillor Campbell seconds. Go on.
Thank you. These are approved. Moving on to agenda item 11, external audit plan update. I now call on Sebastian Evans to introduce this report, please.
Yes, thank you. You will recall at the start of March when we were last here in person, Sarah Einmunger presented the audit plan, which set out at that time our high-level approach to the audit. And I think it is worth emphasising before I go through the addendum that the vast majority of the work that we'll be doing does essentially sort of stay the same insofar as the overall structure of how an audit is done remains the same, even in this new environment. And what will tend to be the largest and highest risk balances will continue to be the largest and highest risk balances. And those will be the areas where we focus the majority of our work. That being said, the addendum attached does formally set out what we think the impact on our audit and value for money work is. The first thing, I think, as Chris mentioned earlier, was the sort of fact that there have been changes to the timeline, and so me and the team have sort of met with Chris and the accounts team just towards the end of last week, just to work out what's going to work, just in terms of when we perform our year-end field work, but also thinking about practical arrangements, such as of how do we actually sort of work well remotely. Luckily, we do already have some experience of this, having recently completed the NHS external audit season, and so I think sort of good practice which we've learned from there sort of will be sort of as were used as part of this audit and other local government audits as well. So I think a lot of the areas in here are sort of, I suppose, thematically quite similar to the sort of things which you would have seen in item 7 earlier. But just in terms of the specifics, if I can draw your attention to sort of page 5 of the report. What this does is, I think, it sets out sort of why we think sort of the COVID-19 sort of presents a specific audit risk, and specifically sort of what additional procedures we'll be sort of performing in relation to that. I'm happy to take any questions on this.
Does anybody have any questions on this item or comments? No, I think we're clear. Members are requested just to note this report, so I consider we've duly noted it. Hello?
Noted.
Thank you. That concludes the business for tonight's meeting. I declare the meeting closed at 6:12. Thank everybody for participating. Thank you. And for those watching from home, the live streaming will now end. And thanks to all of you. Good night.
Bye-bye.